Okay, welcome everyone. We'll start on time. Always a bit strange hanging onto a microphone like this. I have to suppress my urge to start singing, but anyway, so to start, I'd like to acknowledge that this event is being held on the traditional lands of the Turrbal people. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are present. And on a personal note, I would like to acknowledge the people of Mapoon, Doomadgee and Kowanyama on Cape York Peninsula, where I have worked and lived for periods of time in the past. Representatives from government and industry, UQ colleagues, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I am Professor Mark Moran, Group Leader of Development Effectiveness in UQ's Institute for Social Science Research. And it is my pleasure to welcome you here today to our public lecture on automation and the future of work. This event is being brought to you by the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences through its Institute for Social Science Research and its School of Social Science, along with the Sustainable Minerals Institute and the Centre for Socially Responsibility in Mining. It's great to see such a strong turnout, particularly among our alumni and external stakeholder community. Clearly, there's a lot of interest in this topic of the impact of technology on our changing economies and workforce. We're very fortunate today to have with us Masood Ahmed, President of the Centre for Global Development in Washington, DC. I was fortunate to spend January of last year with the Centre for Global Development as a visiting fellow. The influence of their research and analysis on the development policies of USAID and multilateral institutions is something that I hope we could aspire to do here at UQ in our own country and the Indo-Pacific region that we live in. The lecture will run approximately 30 minutes, which will be followed by a short Q&A session. We have beverages and light catering for those who can stay to carry on the discussion after the lecture. I will now welcome to the front our Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences Executive Dean, Professor Heather Zwicker, who will introduce our guest. Professor Zwicker recently joined the university from the University of Alberta, Canada, where she held the position of Vice Provost and Dean, Faculty of Graduate Studies and Research. She now leads the faculty. We're very happy to have her, which includes somehow managing 7 schools and many research centres and institutes in preparing our students as industry leaders, policy makers and change makers of the future. Professor Zwicker.
Thank you very much, Mark, for that warm welcome. And I would like to also pay my respects to the traditional custodians of this land, the waters, the skies, and to pay my respects particularly to elders past, present, and emerging. I very much want to welcome all of you here, industry colleagues, government partners, alumni, staff, and students. It feels quite auspicious to be holding an event like this, which causes us to think about the future during O Week, when we navigate through all sorts of people who are also thinking about the future. As anybody with a mobile telephone knows, the impacts of technological innovations in our lifetime have been huge. We can communicate with people all over the globe with incredible speed and efficiency. We see the production and transportation of goods in moving at an entirely different pace and in a very different organization than we may have grown up with and been used to. These innovations have certainly driven economic growth and afforded new opportunities for knowledge transfer, labor mobility, and global interconnectedness. As anybody with a mobile phone also knows, that can be a bit of a mixed blessing. For all of its benefits, innovation can sometimes create social or marketplace disruption while it comes into fruition. And the obvious go-to examples here are well known by people in this room: Uber, GoGet, Car Next Door, Airbnb. Phenomena that are now local to us and global in their reach. In the case of automation and artificial intelligence, the scope of disruption is a topic of concern, especially regarding its impact on future economic and employment opportunities. So we need to pay attention to fully understand and prepare for economic disruption by technological automations. I'm very happy to introduce our speaker, Mr. Masood Ahmed, who has joined us to discuss these important issues. Mr. Ahmed is president of the Center for Global Development. He joined the center in early 2017 following a 35-year career driving international development policy initiatives at major international institutions, including the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the United Kingdom Government Department for International Development. As president of the Center for Global Development, he leads an internationally renowned think tank that shapes intellectual debate to underpin policy and practice with the goal of reducing global poverty. The Center for Global Development's main areas of focus are global health policy, migration, displacement and humanitarian policy, sustainable development finance, technological applications for development challenges, and the macroeconomic implications of technology change, and national government policies and programs for global development. His talk today is entitled "The Future of Work in the Developing World," and I would invite you to join me in welcoming Mr. Masood Ahmed.
Thank you very much, Professor Zwicker, for that introduction. Mark, thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this conversation, to share with you some thoughts, and thank you all for taking the time to come and spend an hour this morning having this this conversation. I really would like it to be a bit of a conversation if we can spare enough time at the end, and I'd like to make sure we have enough time to have that exchange, because I'd be interested in your perspectives on it. Particularly, we're talking about the future, and I would very much welcome the perspectives of people who are now planning their future. I see many of you sitting here or thinking about what you would like to do in terms of what kind of work awaits you as you move forward into the labor force. And it's a topic on which you get a lot of media. Many people talking about self-driving cars, they're talking about automation. But surprisingly, it's a topic on which there really isn't as much underlying research to help us be clearer about what to make of the uncertainties. And that's one of the things that I'd like to talk a little bit more about as we go along. And to the extent that's true of the topic in general, it's even more true when we talk about the impact of technological change on the nature of work in developing countries. That's something which I think would be a nice topic for many of you to do research on in the coming years. So I hope I'll be able to excite you enough on the topic that you'll want to do some more work on it. Always useful to start by taking a long view. So let's look at the last 150 years. And the basic message from the last 150 years is that technological change has led to improvements in the lives of people, in living conditions, I'm just going to ignore that little noise and I kind of hope it's go away. Improvement in living conditions and incomes. So over the last 150 years, you can identify some significant technological changes that have happened, innovations, and they've generally led to an improvement in people's living conditions. And there's no reason to assume that going forward, technology won't lead to, in the aggregate, an improvement in our living conditions. However, the second thing that's important is that technology brings about change. I don't know how many of you can identify what that person is doing, what job he has. That is a person who is called a knocker-upper. Now, a knocker-upper is a creation of technological change, because when people first started after the Industrial Revolution, it was the first time that large numbers of people had to be in the same place at the same time, a factory, because there were no factories before that. So when you had factories, you had to get people to start at the same time. And knocker-uppers were people who went around and knocked on people's windows to wake them up so that they could get to the factory on time. And there were many different ways in which knocker-uppers used to do their jobs. Some of them had pea shooters, and they would basically blow peas, hard peas, onto the windows of people to wake them up. And others had long rods like this, long sticks to try and wake you up. But the poor knocker-upper, who has been created by one technological innovation, the factory, lost their reason to be by another technological innovation, the affordable alarm clock. So when people started getting affordable alarm clocks, you no longer needed people to come around and wake you up. And knocker-uppers aren't the only people whose jobs have gone. This is just a list of some of the jobs that used to exist and employ a lot of people that mostly don't exist anymore. And I remember, I'm old enough to remember, a milkman who used to come around in a little electric float. When I was a student in London, you'd see the milkmen coming around every morning in their electric float, dropping off bottles of milk. There are no milkmen doing the rounds now. And this is a whole range of jobs. Some of them, I think, this is a little exaggerated. I think probably taxi dispatchers are still dispatching taxis somewhere, but it just gives you a sense that technology has always led to change and upheaval. And one of the points that's worth remembering is when there have been intensive bursts of technological change, they have generally been followed by periods of social upheaval and political change. So if you actually map the social and political transitions in the world, they map quite closely to big technological movements because they change the way society has to organize itself. And that brings us to the present. So now the question is, we've gone through technological change in the past, we managed it by and large. Why is it that it's going to be different this time? Is it going to be different? And there are basically two kinds of arguments that people advance in explaining why this round of technological change that we're seeing, automation, robotics, just-in-time 3D printing, neurotechnology, all of these changes, why are they going to be different? And one reason is that this nature of change is intrinsically different in the kind of technology from what we have seen in the past. So past technologies helped people to do things that they had to do themselves, made life easier. If you had a machine, you didn't have to lift stuff yourself, but you could rely on the machine. This time around, technology is actually doing things that humans do. It's substituting for what makes us humans. Artificial intelligence is enabling things to be done by machines that we otherwise, I don't know why we went there, sorry, that we would do ourselves. And one of the, for example, technology you can now have through AI, it can read your face, it can tell your emotions from that. There's now technology being developed that is actually going to be able to read your thoughts and be able to articulate your thoughts. And this will change not only the way we work, but our relationship with each other, our relationship with ourselves, and what constitutes our sense of being a human. So for example, now with the neurotechnological enhancements to the brain, it raises all kinds of questions as to how going forward we will manage the ethics of who is able, under what circumstances, to use technology to enhance the intelligence or other attributes of their children and others who won't be able to do that. So it raises all kinds of questions that previous technology didn't raise in the same way. And the second broad argument that people make is that it's just happening much faster and much more broadly going to affect our lives in ways that we're going to have difficulty coping with it. So if you look, for example, the McKinsey Institute, the McKinsey consulting firm has an institute, and they estimate that compared to the first industrial revolution, the current period of change will occur 10 times faster and has a scale that is 300 times larger. So just in terms of our individual and collective capacity to manage change, this is happening at a speed and at a pace that's going to be very hard for us. And the World Economic Forum has talked about how this is going to be exponential change rather than... Doesn't always work as we want it to, but by and large, it's exponential rather than... So people are quite worried about this round for these two reasons. I want to focus on most of my talk on a relatively narrow issue. How will this change the nature of our work? And I think the first thing I should tell you is that there are a wide range of estimates of how significant the change is going to be. I've just given you a few. And as you can see, some people say nearly half the jobs are going to be affected by technology. Other people say, actually, maybe it's much smaller than that. And then some people who've said it's half have gone back and revised it. And Mark reminded me that actually Frey and colleagues have put out a new estimate, which is, I think, 20-some%. And there are other people who are saying, well, actually, it's not that the jobs will disappear, but the nature of the jobs will change very much in terms of the tasks that are going to be done. So there's a lot of uncertainty about it. And even here, I don't know whether some of you saw this report that came out in Australia by the Foundation of Young Australians, which basically is saying, look, more than 2/3 of Australians, as they come into the labor force, will start a job that will change dramatically or disappear in the first 10 months. But much of this is really people trying to give you their best guess of the future. And I think the one key message so far that I would take away is there's a certain amount of uncertainty around this. So let's look at the past. Well, one thing that's actually, why do people worry beyond that is they think the gig economy, Uber, Airbnb, that this is also changing the relationship between workers and employers. So if you work in a company, your rights that you had, the degree of stability and security you had as a worker is going to be much less in some of the gig economy going forward. And this is just a cartoon that kind of makes that point. But I think the serious point here is that there is a broad concern that as society, we have not organized ourselves to deal with a future of work in which the stability and security that people knew when they felt that they had a job is no longer going to be an attribute they can rely on, even if they do the same kind of work. And that's why so many taxi drivers in so many cities are often protesting against the arrival of Uber, because they feel that the alternative life that Uber offers to drivers is one that is less secure and less stable than what they have been used to. Now, if you look at what's actually happened in the reality of the marketplace, here's a nice, interesting chart that I took from David Autor, who, this is from his Eli lecture at this year's American Economic Association meeting in January. And what this looks at is over the last 40 years, what's been happening to the nature of jobs in the United States. And what you see from this is that there's a bunch of jobs here that are relatively low skill and that are paid less, and those jobs have increased as a share of the workforce. And there's a group of jobs at the other end of the spectrum, which are high skill and high productivity, higher income, that have also gone up as a share of the workforce. So both at the low skill end and at the high skill end, the professionals, the managers, the technicians have seen an increase in their share of the jobs. But in the middle, there's a large number of people who were working in production or who were working in sales or in office management or in accountancy or in administration, and their jobs have been replaced by technology. So those jobs have disappeared. And as a result, the people who were working in those jobs, some of them have been able to acquire the skills and benefit from this, but actually a large number of them have not been able to acquire the skills to take on the high-end jobs and are now doing some of the jobs that previously, with that set of skills and qualifications, they think they would be able to do better paid ones. So they're now the ones who are migrating into this set of jobs. And that, of course, is part of the explanation of why there has been a degree of resentment, a sense of being left behind. Some people call it the hollowing out of the middle class. And you see, this is one reflection of that. Now, this is not driven only by technology, because the production jobs that have gone away in the United States, this is the US chart, the production jobs have gone away as much because of trade, because production has moved to other parts of the world, as is because of technology. But of course, that trade has been made possible by the fact that it's so much cheaper now to move things around the world, and so much easier to move things around the world than was the case 50 years ago. So a combination of trade and technology has resulted in many of those jobs disappearing. And this poses a big social problem for us, because as a society, we have not been very good at dealing with the consequences of this polarization and of the inequality in incomes and wealth that has come from it. And here's a picture that shows you that inequality. So this is again the United States. If you look at what's been happening to the share of income between the top 1% of people, which are in blue, and the bottom 50% of people, which are in red, what you see is that since 1970, there's been a widening of inequality to the point where today the top 1% of people are earning almost twice as much as the bottom 50% of society put together. So this is one of the consequences of that polarization of jobs. But the important point I want to make is that this is not destiny. Technology is not destiny. It's up to us as societies to intermediate the effect of the forces of globalization and the forces of technology through policy. So this is the picture for the United States. Now, same picture for Germany. Same period, same two lines, but showing a very different outcome. Actually, the country where the number of robots has grown the fastest is Germany. And yet, they have managed, through policies, to end up with a much smaller degree in the increase in inequality than we saw in the US. So outcomes are a function not only of the forces of technology, of globalization, but they're also the consequence of the policy measures that we put in place to manage those forces. And some societies have chosen to manage in this way, other societies have chosen to manage that way. And that's a public policy discussion, which is why I personally believe that public policy is what we should all be focused on, because public policy is what makes the difference between how we intermediate outcomes for different things. Now, that's kind of big picture looking mostly at the rich countries. And what does all this mean for developing countries? And I think the first thing to remember is that the developing countries are in a very different context. The starting point is very different. And just some ways in which it's different is that the economic structure is very different. The capacity of governments to manage change is often more limited, the institutional capacity. The way work is done is very different, because actually in many developing countries, 80% of the people are working in the informal sector. They're not working in the formal sector. The demographics are different, and that the developing countries themselves, is a very diverse set of countries. So we tend to use the term developing countries, but if you try and compare what's happening in Thailand with what's happening in Yemen, or what's happening in Zambia with what's happening in Brazil, these are all very, very different situations. And I've got 2 or 3 charts that just show you how different they are. And here's one which is important, because technology has to take into account relative prices. So it may make sense for me to put in a robot in the US to work on garments, but it may not be economical for me to put the same robot in to go and work and substitute for humans in Bangladesh. That said, people are experimenting. Adidas, the shoe manufacturers, makes about 300 million pairs of shoes every year, and it employs 1 million people, mostly in East Asia and in Africa, who make these shoes for them. In 2016, they set up a factory in Germany, which made 250,000 pairs of shoes with 200 people, because it was all done by robots. And they put in another factory in the United States a year later, which does the same thing. So the question for us is, 10 years from now, will Adidas be making 300 million pairs of shoes, of which 290 are going to be done the way they're being done today, and 10 million are being done out of these specialized factories? Or will the bulk of the shoes being produced in 10 years be done in factories near where they're sold, using automation, with a few outlying factories still using the technology and the people today? And if those people won't have those jobs, the question, of course, is what kinds of things will they do? Another thing that's different, as I said, is the structure of the economy is very different. So if you look at Africa, if you look at African GDP, manufacturing is actually quite a small part of the economy. Already many people are working in services, but these services, as I said, are mostly unregulated, informal economy, and their ability to have technology substitute for them is going to be something which we don't have a very good handle on. Another thought, demographics. I'm again using Africa for demographics because it's the most striking feature of demographic differences. So most parts of the world in 30 years will have fewer young people than they do today. But Africa is going to have double the number of working age people in 35 years, and their overall population is going to double over that period and then go up again. So the only part of the world that's going to have a huge increase in the numbers of working people. And of course, that raises many issues that go beyond the nature of work, which is, if you're going to have 800 million young people in Africa looking for how to make their life, what kind of work they should do, what kind of skills they have, where should they work? These are all questions that I think are going to be central to a conversation about the future of the world, about migration, about how you manage these big differences in demography. But in terms of the nature of work, in Europe, where the number of working age people is going down, automation can actually help, because some of the jobs that you don't have people anymore to do, you can now get automation and robots to do for you. But in Africa, where the number of young people is actually increasing, automation isn't a help in the same way, and you have to think through how you can make that work. Now, let's not get depressed. There are many positive factors as well. We economists have a tendency to also focus on things that are likely to go wrong, but it's important to recognize that actually technology has huge positive potential for developing countries. And even now you can see, for example, there's a rapid growth in these economies of the digital-based activities. The IT sector is fastest growing sector in India, for example. The IT sector now accounts for 1/3 of all of the exports, and for revenue, I think about $170 billion. So this is clearly something that in a number of countries, people are seeing rapid growth in fintech, in information, in digital-based business. And the bit about the gig economy, I want to say, you know, you remember that little picture about Uber and how we think of people moving from the formal economy into Uber or Airbnb as losing some degree of formality? But in many developing countries, where they start from a very informal sector, actually, if you're a driver that switches from driving a taxi to working for Uber, you have much more job security than you had before. So we have to remember that the gig economy, as we think of it in societies where there are well-established formal mechanisms for workers, does not apply in the same way. And finally, I think also what you see is a lot of investments being made in training in many countries, from the tech sector. So I don't want us to sort of go away with the sense that there are only risks or downsides. So what's our best estimate of how much this is going to impact the nature of work? And again, I think here, even more uncertainty. What I find quite interesting is the degree of precision that you see in these estimates. So some of them are down to 41, 44, 46%. Honestly, I would say plus or minus 20%. So I don't think we really have a very good sense. So these are essentially estimates that, based on running a methodology, give you a number, but you don't want to take these numbers as implying any degree of precision about what the likely outcomes are going to be. People get really worried about manufacturing in developing countries. Why is that? Because, as I said before, manufacturing is not such a big share of the total. And in fact, Danny Roderick and others have written important papers showing how what they're calling premature deindustrialization, which is that the manufacturing sector is peaking as a share of GDP below 15% in many countries before they become rich. So rich countries, manufacturing is a very small part of their economy because you've already moved into services. But we did so after incomes had risen. And the reason why manufacturing jobs are so important in the minds of how you think about development is because our model of development was about taking surplus labor off agriculture that would move into relatively low-skilled manufacturing jobs. That's where productivity would go up, incomes would go up, and would bring them to the next level. And I think that was the traditional way we thought about the way development happened. Now, if manufacturing is no longer going to be a driver of that kind of growth, where will the productivity increase and the income increase for people coming off agriculture happen? Will it be in services? The IMF produced a report last year which seems to suggest that you could actually have high productivity jobs in services that could drive that improvement in income. But do we think that the education system in these countries is providing people with the skills they need to do high productivity services jobs in the kind of scale that would be previously done in manufacturing? And how feasible is it that services alone will be able to drive that job? I've got this chart here for people who work in the Bangladeshi apparel industry because of one other point. Most of these people are women who work in the apparel industry in Bangladesh. And the apparel industry, since the 1980s, has not only led to an improvement in incomes and an improvement in exports for Bangladesh and for the people who work there, it has transformed the status of women and their relative status in that society, in that part, because they have become major earners. And because their economic contribution, their degree of independence from working exchange, it's had a huge impact on the sociology of the communities within which those women live who are working in this. So at the moment, it's very hard to produce garments using automation because garments are kind of, they're soft and they're pliable, and robots like to have things that are a little bit firmer. But if you go on YouTube, you can see a new machine which is able to stitch jeans. A lot of these people are making jeans, which is able to stitch jeans together, because the way they do it is that they take the denim fabric and they make it like a sheet of cardboard, hard. And they stitch it as a hard. It goes through a washing process that makes it soft. So if the robots can't work with soft material, we make the material hard. And in 5 years' time, they'll be able to work with soft material. So I think the manufacturing sector has had a consequence that is larger than the way simple numbers would have you believe. So I want to end on one point, which is technology being there doesn't mean technology gets used. Here are two technologies, right? One was invented in 1973, the other was invented in 1592. And yet today, 2 billion more people are using the cell phone than have access to a toilet. Okay. So it's not that the toilet technology hasn't been around. It's been around for a long time. What enables people to take advantage of technology is a combination of policies, of affordability, and therefore, I keep coming back to my core point that we need to think about the policy framework that enables the use of technology and the development of technology to be done in a way that meets our societal objectives. And when you look at developing countries, we don't really have any consensus on what the impact is going to be. It varies a lot. It depends a lot on how each society prepares itself and guides itself. So the kinds of differences you're seeing in inequality between the US and Germany, you can see in many ways across developing countries because their own capacity to manage change varies a lot across them. And one final thought on that is the financial constraints to prepare societies for dealing with this scope and pace of technological change is something that will be an additional constraint factor for developing countries. And I want to end by saying that we've been talking mostly about the nature of work. But I want to end where I started, which is that if you think about people's concerns about how to manage the AI revolution, they go beyond the nature of work. So they affect data privacy. They affect the use of advanced artificial intelligence for surveillance. In many countries now, AI is being used in ways for surveillance that raises for people issues of how they want to organize it. They worry about social media being used for disinformation to create political and social unrest in ways that we don't have a way of managing today. They worry about the ethics of algorithms that will drive machines in the future. So when you have a car that will be driving by itself, and it has to make a choice between either running over the child that's come in front of you or going off the road and killing the occupant, how will it make that choice? Who will have programmed that into the car? Is it going to be the car manufacturer? Is it going to be the person who wrote the algorithm? Is it going to be as the owner of the car, the user of the car? Do you have any say in what the car does faced with that situation? So people worry that we don't have, as a society, the infrastructure or the mechanisms to have a conversation about these issues, and yet these things are being programmed into the technology that we are going to be using. And finally, here's a thought. Do you know that after the Industrial Revolution, when people started using machines, they didn't have to do heavy work themselves. In 50 years, the human race became physically weaker. And we have been physically weaker since then. So there's a group of scientists who are very concerned that once we start relying on artificial intelligence and stop using our brain muscles, in 50 years, what will this do to the average IQ of people? Will it actually, in the same way that we became physically weaker? I find that very hard to believe, I have to tell you. I mean, not because I have any scientific or empirical reason to challenge that claim, but I just find that sort of very hard to accept. But it is a question that people have put on the table. So I think while it is important for us to be focusing on the nature of work and how it's going to be changed by technology, this has to be embedded in a much broader conversation about how we manage technological change for societies and how we deal the underlying ethical consequences and considerations that affect that change. So let me stop with that. Happily listen to your views.